Chapter 101, Alien Spacecraft Hidden in Meteorite Rain. The twists of fate are truly wondrous. Not long ago, Luther had been banished by his father to a backwater chemical plant within the Luther Group, seemingly discarded by the man who tolerated nothing but perfection. In the blink of an eye, his father died in a car accident, and Luther inherited the helm of the Luther Empire. Outwardly, Lionel Luther had only one son. Who else would inherit everything? But Luther knew his father better than others did. Lionel had a secret, an illegitimate son who had been carefully hidden away and raised by his mother. Lionel thought he had hidden him well. He had not counted on Luther. The world had always seen him as a profligate rich second son. In private, Luther remembered why he had cultivated that image. When he was young, he had staged petty rebellions to win his cold father's attention, and the reputation of wastrel stuck. To prevent the hyenas, smelling blood, from carving up the empire that should be mine, I had to strike first, he told himself. Behind his desk, his eyes were cold as a 1,000-year frost. He murmured softly, as if speaking to the man who had shaped him. To achieve greatness, one must cast aside emotions. That's what you taught me, Father. Don't blame me now, right? The illegitimate son had been born after Lionel betrayed Luther's mother while she was pregnant. When Luther finally confirmed his father was really dead, he made one cold phone call in the hospital room before the corpse, and overnight he sent that hidden family to ruin. The light of the phone screen threw a dark shadow over his face. The memory of other moments from his youth lingered too. The psychologist hired by the exclusive school he had wrecked with a string of outrageous pranks. Well, Luther, who skips school every day, judging by that spotless, too perfect report card, you're clearly brilliant, the white-haired, bespectacled psychiatrist had said, his voice professional. He had treated Nobel laureates and even the first man on the moon. His opinion carried weight. But you show worrying signs. The doctor had frowned that afternoon. Compulsive behaviors, poor social interaction and emotional cognition, significant moral deficits. Your autocratic parents' insults, rejection, and neglect damaged your self-esteem in early years. Combined with a severe lack of care, this has produced a malignant narcissistic complex. If this continues, from my professional perspective, you're on a path toward antisocial behavior, megalomania, cold-bloodedness. The most dangerous thing is that your genius and your family's wealth could make you one of the most dangerous people alive. Before the old man, already shaky with age, could finish his judgment, the young Luther sprang from his chair and hit him hard. Do you think you can see a man's life from a few observations? He snapped. You didn't see this punch coming. The old doctor would later need dentures and a hefty settlement. A humiliated Lionel had to come to the school to apologize and pull favors to bury the incident. Luther only shook his head when he recalled it. People always mock their younger selves. If this were the present Luther, the psychologist's words would not have stirred him in the least. Great men in history never worry about ordinary opinions, he thought, eyes hard. Some people are born to be ruled, others are born to rule. The lion does not hear the bleating of the lamb. I don't know if I'll become the most dangerous man on this planet, he said, but I will become the most powerful. He pressed a button with an arrogant, clinical calm. The video paused. A super slow, ultra-clear frame froze on the screen. Someone plummeting from a building dozens of meters high, then a powerful young hand grabbing his clothes and catching him. The cloth did not tear despite enormous inertia. It was impossible under normal physics. What fabric can withstand that force? He whispered. He scrolled through old files, pulling up anomalies he'd cataloged about this so-called Superman. A miraculous protective field, perhaps, one that could shield clothing and maybe extend to shield other people. He brought up another clear image. A tall young man in a blue shirt, radiating raw authority, pointing and scolding some suspects in front of a camera. The gesture was fierce, sincere. There was no pretense in his anger. But when Luther zoomed in on the man's eyes, they looked oddly large and lifeless, wrong in a way he couldn't ignore. Other footage confirmed the impression. Awkward posture when addressing others, staring off-center, as if the man had not been taught simple social graces, or as if something in his vision was off. He has abilities no ordinary person should have, Luther mused with a slow smile. fingers steepled beneath his chin. Stronger than a locomotive, faster than sound, a body that can't be destroyed, unique among those affected by the meteor showers. His mind began to assemble a plan. This beast called Superman could be trapped and studied. Whether he was a product of the meteorite or something else, Luthor intended to find out. The meteorites in Smallville had brought a string of inexplicable events. Luthor had once lost a wishing stone there, and later realized he'd been compelled to continue investigating the town's meteorites. Then, in a single night, all the meteorites vanished. Not only did they disappear from Smallville, but samples gathered and studied across the world also evaporated without a trace. He had lost the wishing stone in that town. Someone, whoever had used the stone, had wished for the meteorites to vanish. Why? Were they trying to prevent more people like Superman from appearing? Luthor's interest sharpened. The rocks were gone, but those they had affected remained. Under the pretense of offering treatment, he had set up a biological lab to research the genetically altered survivors. Still, none of them matched this one man. The meteorite might have triggered the strongest reaction in him, but Luthor allowed for another possibility. He leaned back, eyes distant, recalling a report from over a decade ago. When the meteor shower struck that unremarkable town, a crop duster pilot spraying pesticides had been terrified and climbed steep to escape the shower. In that desperate near-death moment, he glimpsed something at the center of the meteorite swarm. That central object had not been a rock at all. It had been a spaceship. Chapter 102, Byproducts of Meteorites. They all said I went mad after nearly being killed in that meteor shower, and they revoked my pilot's license. But I wasn't insane. I'm certain there was a spacecraft at the center of that shower. Even if it was so small, it looked like it could only carry a baby. Who says aliens have to be our size? Why couldn't it be a baby? When Lex Luthor started digging into the string of incidents connected to the meteorites, he unexpectedly found that man. Reeking of alcohol and clutching a bottle, the drunkard gestured wildly and talked with feverish conviction about the events that had ruined his life. If this world had magic and genetic mutation, why couldn't it have aliens? Lex assembled a lavish team of experts from across the globe, medical researchers, psychiatrists, interrogators, hypnotists, just to evaluate a down-and-out ex-pilot living in a drafty shack and drinking himself to oblivion. The consensus: there was better than a 98% chance the man was telling the truth. Lex stood in front of a monitor, staring at the shadow in the red cape like a hunter examining prey through his rifle sights. In a glass case on the wall, a suit of green steel armor, bristling with high technology, gleamed under the lights, the fruit of his latest research. It was a last resort, a contingency for when pure science needed to be backed by force. When will those in power ever get their hands dirty with a beast? He muttered. He picked up the phone. The plan needed muscle, and he needed someone to take point. The contact was saved as General Sam Lane, general and congressman. General Lane, Lex said, voice carefully ingratiating, I hear the military's been tracking and trying to contain a special living organism. Perhaps I can be of assistance. His words were humble. His tone carried the confidence of a man who already imagined the other side as prey. On the other end, a cold, guarded voice asked, What do you mean? Even if the meteorites are gone, you still have a weak point, David said, watching Clark closely. Clark flinched. That old, helpless feeling was something he never wanted to experience again. You can move normally for short stretches because you've got super hearing, like you have supervision, right? David continued. Clark had never mentioned when the extra hearing developed, but David had guessed from how Clark could orient himself and move in fractions of a second. David didn't know whether Clark was hiding it to protect himself or to keep people from taking advantage of it. Yes, Clark admitted after a brief pause, even the best hearing can't replace sight. There'll always be places your ears can't reach. David's voice was gentle but firm. And if you rely on hearing too much, an enemy who knows that will try to target it. Sonic weapons, modulators, get more sun, that won't hurt you. Clark opened his mouth, hesitated, then nodded. He still believed that without the meteorites he was safe. Besides super hearing, he had super speed. Sound was slow compared to him. He could clear several kilometers in an instant. But he didn't want to argue with David. His brother had just returned, and Clark was tired of fighting. Also, Clark began, what else? David watched him falter. Superman had many vulnerabilities, red sunlight, kryptonite, but this one was less known. David hemmed and hawed, then asked, do you think a stone, once ground into powder, can still be called a stone? Probably not. Clark frowned, puzzled. Clark's expression hardened as a memory hit him. He remembered losing control, remembered making a wish that all the meteorites that could weaken him would disappear. The price paid had been nearly unbearable. Could it be? He started. Yes, David said quietly, reciting the wish exactly as Clark had made it. He reached into his coat and pulled out a glass test tube filled with a faintly green, fluorescent liquid. The meteorites may be gone, but some things that restrain you can remain. Clark's legs weakened. He grabbed the railing with a white-knuckled hand. The familiar, draining numbness washed over him again, less intense than before, but unmistakable. Meteorites. David, what is that? He asked, voice strained. A byproduct of the meteorites. David shook the test tube. The liquid glowed inside. This was the refined product he'd extracted when the collected meteorites vanished after Clark's wish, what remained of a batch that had the ability to dampen Kryptonian powers. The wishing stone had erased the stones themselves, but it had missed these processed residues. Clark sagged, gasping like a creature freed from sunlight, then slowly regained a little strength. David tucked the tube away, unwilling to let Clark suffer more than necessary. It's not the rocks themselves, but the research and derivatives labs made when those meteorites arrived. Many labs sampled them. The meteorites disappeared, but researchers had already isolated byproducts. The chance you'll run into them is small, but it's not zero. Clark nodded slowly, the memory of that weakness still fresh. The threat wasn't purely gone, it had simply changed form. Chapter 103. Clark was taken away. I know. Clark, having regained some strength, took 2 deep breaths. His face held a hint of resentment. He could guess why his brother hadn't told him sooner. Maybe David had been waiting for the right moment to pull a trump card, ready to wave it in his face when he was confident he could stop him, leaving Clark humiliated. Or perhaps David feared Clark might again come under the influence of red kryptonite and change, so he kept something to control him. I'll be careful, Clark said. He didn't want to think about it any longer. He, too, had concealed his super hearing from David. Seeing his brother nod, the chances of a setback felt smaller. David turned and went downstairs to sleep, deciding to rest at home for a few days. Traveling to the North Sea, conquering Paradise Island, and fighting Ares had drained him. Besides, for the next month, he'd have to supervise the Amazons' dance practice. Hard work, not restful in the least. Clark, however, still had work to do. Chloe's reporting assistant by day, Superman by necessity. The title, Superman, reminded him of Lois Lane, Chloe's famous cousin. He stood at the apartment desk, organizing interview transcripts, and looked out the window as a memory surfaced. He remembered being embarrassed in front of Lana over a meteorite necklace. She'd helped pick up his books and teased him, asking whether he was an ordinary man or Superman. He hadn't expected to become Superman. He didn't reject the name. It seemed to fit in a strange way. He wondered whether the glamorous reporter had simply labeled him a superhuman or if she'd been thinking of Nietzsche's Übermensch, a leader among men, a being who transcends himself, a creator of values. He murmured the idea under his breath, feeling the weight of responsibility it implied. Could he live up to it? Could he justify the hopes others invested in him? His ears twitched. A voice far across the city in a prison reached him. This city has failed me. Those fools dared to lock up Mr. Metropolis. Because of gangs, murder, drug dealing, bribery, do they know how much I give to charity? How much I spend? I will make this city pay. I want them to taste pain 100 times worse than mine. Glenn Morgan's voice, hoarse, venomous, spat rage through the visitation glass. Is the plan ready, Olson? Anytime, sir. At 7 o'clock, the train will arrive on time. Good. When I'm back, it'll be dinner. I want to enjoy my caviar while I watch the headlines from prison. Certainly, sir. Olson, Glenn Morgan's top assassin, nodded without emotion. After the call ended, he left the prison and began mobilizing his men. Clark listened, every detail sharpening into alarm. When he heard the plan to put a bomb on a city high-speed train, he snapped to his feet. His chair skidded back and scraped the floor. "What's wrong, Clark?" Chloe, recently home from an interview and resting, sat up hearing the commotion. "Emergency. I have to go." He glanced at his watch. 6:50. No time to explain. He grabbed his clothes and left. There was no time to waste. Innocent lives, on a train, on a city block, depended on him. He had to find which train had the proximity bomb. At dusk, King's Station, a 16-car cuff, nearly mile-long high-speed train had just departed. Clark, cape snapping behind him, moved like a gale, launching from the rooftops of distant buildings. He dropped down beside the platform in a furious descent. Gravel skittered and the pavement spidered with cracks where he landed. "It's Superman," someone yelled. Passengers waiting, phones in hand, stared as if a god had descended. Clark shouted, "Get back! There's a bomb! Move to a safe place!" Without waiting, he forced a sealed safety door open. Steel groaned and bent under his strength. He sprang into the tunnel and pursued the train along the tracks. The train, a sleek bullet of steel, roared by at 400 kilometers per hour. Clark's perception slowed. He ripped open the roof and dropped into a car. "Where is the bomb?" he demanded, tearing through luggage and seats. Before coming, he'd forced Olsen to experience the dizzying height of Metropolis's tallest building until fear made him confess which train was targeted, but not the bomb's exact location. Calls to the operative who'd planted it went unanswered. There's no time, Clark thought. He used his force field to gently push passengers out of harm's way while he searched, but even that was too slow. The bomb might not be under a seat. It could be hidden anywhere. He couldn't even hear the bombs ticking. The perpetrators had designed the sensor to trigger at the next station when the train passed, detonating the device. He flashed off the train and onto the next platform, swallowing hard. The train, a steel python, hurtled toward him at 400 kilometers per hour. If he stopped it abruptly, the force transmitted between carriages would crumple the steel like paper. Carriages would derail, collide, explode. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, could die, and the bomb would still go off. He planted his feet and stared down the speeding train. "No one will die today," he said through clenched teeth. As the wind howled, he extended his arms and met the front of the train. A blast of compressed air threw up dust and debris. His muscles strained. He used his unique force field to brace the train's momentum, absorbing and distributing the enormous kinetic energy so the rest of the cars would not be catapulted into chaos. Steel screamed and buckled where his hands met the nose. For a terrible, suspended instant, physics itself seemed to warp under his will. The front of the train deformed, then stopped. Chemical suits and military vehicles arrived within minutes, cordoning off the scene. Reporters broadcast live as stunned passengers disembarked, bewildered. The train's nose had been crushed back in rippling waves, but behind the deformation, the rest of the cars sat intact on the rails. Two deep footprints, where someone had planted their feet and braced, had crushed the ties and sunk into the ballast. Clark, exhausted, had given everything. He collapsed, unconscious, at the front of the train. Medics moved in. Dozens owed their lives to him. Back home, the smell of Martha Kent's beef stew drifted through the house. Dinner was being prepared, simple, comforting potatoes and stew. In the living room, David and Jonathan sat watching television, waiting for Clark to come home and dine together. The newscaster panicked as the screen cut to an emergency report. Breaking news. A man identified as Superman leaped into King's Station and warned passengers of a bomb. He intercepted high-speed train AZ-187, bringing it to a stop with incredible strength, then collapsed from exhaustion. We are watching live footage now. The camera swept past soldiers and hazmat-suited technicians. The deformed front of the train showed the violent forces that had been absorbed. Men in protective suits examined the footprint impressions and collected samples of debris. The reporter continued, voice trembling. It's unclear whether there was an actual explosive device on board. In the last month, Superman has saved the lives of over 100 citizens in this city. The exhausted and unconscious Superman was taken away earlier by a military helicopter. We hope the military will release him after investigation. David's face went pale. He stood abruptly, eyes glued to the screen, where the cordoned-off scene played over and over. "Clark," he whispered, voice breaking. Chapter 104. Show me what he is. The beast is caged. On the large monitor, Luther stroked his chin with a smirk as another room came into view. The young man in the blue t-shirt lay unconscious, secured in a purpose-built electric chair with massive ball-like shackles. Only his forearms, calves, and head were exposed. The rest of him disappeared into an unbroken mass of metal. Twin sonic emitters hovered inches from his ears, calibrated and ready. Everything had been prepared to prevent any sudden movements if he woke. Even so, outside the room, its walls sheathed in polished steel, a line of heavily armed soldiers waited tensely, as if a dangerous animal had been locked away behind them. "You didn't tell me your plan involved knocking him out with a high-speed train full of passengers," the middle-aged general barked. His gray hair stood in a stiff, needle-like line, his posture as rigid as a bayonet. He watched the screen with a scowl. Whether the unique organism or the train's occupants suffered, he didn't want to hear it. No, Luther said, waving a finger as if correcting a childish simplification. "He didn't get knocked out." "What's the difference?" General Sam Lane shot back. "You wanted Superman, and I gave you Superman." Luther shrugged. Explanations were wasted on an old-school soldier who measured everything by drills and orders. He passed out from exhaustion. General Lane snorted, disdain powerful in the single word. "I've never heard of a human inhaling enough anesthetic gas to fell thousands of Asian elephants and only slowing their heartbeat a little. Even oxygen at that level would be toxic. First, get a blood sample. I want to know what he really is." "A blood sample?" Luther's brow rose. "His skin is probably impenetrable. Even a titanium drill might not bite. With what do you intend to draw blood, General?" Lane said nothing, but the look in his eyes suggested he had a plan of his own. "Is it Clark? Has he been captured?" Across town, in a modest living room, Martha Lane clapped a hand over her mouth, pale as the television relayed the news. "Superman is Clark? They've taken him?" Jonathan froze on the sofa, then jumped up, panic tightening his face. "Mom, Dad, how could this happen?" David watched the screen with a hard expression. Clark had told him not to tell their parents. He hadn't wanted them to worry, and had asked David to keep his secret. Yet seeing his parents' fear now, it was obvious they had suspected something for some time. Whenever Superman came up, Clark had changed the subject or grown uneasy. The Lanes had pieced it together. The idea that a metahuman with that power could just happen to appear in Metropolis now felt less like coincidence and more like confirmation. Martha's voice cracked as she spoke through tears. The couple had joked at dinner when the first stories ran. Another meteor-powered metahuman, maybe, and at least one of them seemed intent on doing good, but Clark had been blind to everyone. The reporting alone had been unlikely, and Clark's behavior since then had only deepened their worry. "This isn't the time," Jonathan said, folding his hands as he steadied himself. "You need to get him back." David snapped into action. With a grim nod, he left the house and accelerated, a blur of motion that carved wind through the quiet streets. He hit nearly 30 times the speed of sound in an instant. What would have been a long, tense drive took him less than 30 seconds. Template fusion, 9%. Since his Black King template fusion surged on Paradise Island, David's energy manipulation had skyrocketed. He could now push his body to new heights by expending reserves of energy. Strength and speed both amplified to stunning levels. At the cordoned Metropolis platform, soldiers kept civilians at bay as military technicians completed their final sampling. The scene looked clinical and controlled, but tension hummed in the air. "How could something like this happen?" Lois Lane asked, arriving with her photographer and assistant, Jimmy Olsen. The taped-off area and the nervous, mechanized efficiency of the operation filled her with a bad feeling. She started toward the officers doing the sweep, intending to demand answers from her father, when a sudden gust of wind cut through the crowd. In the center of the perimeter, a slender figure appeared, lit from within by a low purple glow. He moved with a cold, precise calm, stepping through the cordon as if the soldiers weren't there. Without ceremony, he seized one of them by the throat and lifted him off his feet. The man's boots barely brushed the pavement. "Which base are you from?" the newcomer demanded, his voice low and icy, every syllable a razor. Chapter 1 of 5. You must be prepared to bear the price. "Which base are you from?" David's voice was ice cold as he gripped the man by the collar. Dark energy pulsed off him, a suffocating aura that felt like an apex predator towering over an ant, an instinctive, overwhelming suppression. "Who are you? Tell me now." The soldiers' faces went white. How had this man gotten inside the cordoned-off zone? "Hands up! Kneel!" an officer barked. Black muzzles swung toward David, accompanied by urgent orders from the elite troops. David ignored them, as if the guns were toys. "Don't make me repeat myself." There was no heat in his voice. His eyes burned with a fierce purple light as he stared down the man in his grip. The pressure from him made everyone's hair stand on end. The captive's survival instinct snapped like a twig. I'll die for sure," he stammered, teeth chattering. 14 miles north of Metropolis, base code named 604, the soldier blurted without thinking. "Good. Congratulations on keeping your life." David tossed the man aside. He hit the ground and scrambled backward, shaking with terror as the word monster fell from his lips. "Fire!" The sergeant major's shout cracked through the tunnel, and gunfire erupted. Casings clattered as bullets sprayed the platform. David stood unmoved, frowning, his purple glow intensifying like a storm about to break. A crushing pressure rolled out from him. Everyone felt as though a prehistoric beast were looking straight at them. Their chests tightened, legs gave out, strength drained away, the sensation of death on the wind. Just as David prepared to respond, he noticed something. Reporters and bystanders rushing forward with live cameras, hungry to capture the scene. He paused, displeased at being filmed. In an instant, a purple flash, the towering presence vanished from where he'd stood. 1 second, 2, then several, and an eerie silence settled. He left?" someone whispered. A man collapsed, trembling, and the others slowly recovered enough to scan the area with their guns. The terrifying figure was gone. The soldiers let out shaky breaths, the relief of people who had narrowly escaped something unnameable. The sergeant major shouted into his radio, voice still tight, "Report to base. An unknown, extremely fast humanoid may be heading toward base 604. He glared at the soldier who'd given information away. "You'll answer to a military court." Normally, that threat would cow them. Tonight, it mattered not. Surviving was worth any punishment. No one would care about courts now. None of them had felt that purple heat inches from their faces and lived to tell it. Meanwhile, in a secured laboratory far from the platform, Lex Luthor watched a live feed with interest. A researcher in a hazmat suit held a metal syringe, its needle gleaming. They tried to pierce Superman's skin, but the needle bounced off like it had struck dense, high-grade rubber. Lex's brow creased. "It didn't dent? What is this syringe made of?" General Sam Lane's jaw was tight. This creature's skin might be harder than the classified Promethean alloys the military kept under lock and key. He didn't like how things were going. Clark opened his eyes weakly. He remembered diverting the train, using that strange protective field at full force, and then blacking out. Now he found himself in a quiet room, shackled to a steel chair, a hot needle probing his arm veins. "Who captured me? Let me go," he demanded, trying to wrench free, but his limbs wouldn't respond. Someone had drugged him. Even weakened, he should have broken the restraints. Luthor watched Clark awaken like a scientist observing a brute. "It's already remarkable. The limit is human strength," he said with clinical calm. The needle's metal was harder than anything he'd seen. The flaw was the operator's lack of force. "General Lane, is this alloy available on the open market?" Lex's mind raced. If he could cast his battle armor from that metal, it would change everything. "Use a hydraulic press on the syringe. Apply more force," Lex urged. "You want me to? Let me go, General Lane." Clark snapped from the chair. His struggle made the electric restraints groan. The researchers edged away. The base personnel remembered the train incident and decided to increase the interrogation's intensity. A surge of current shot through Clark. Steam rose from his clothes, but his muscles spasmed without breaking. "Voltage is maxed," cried the technician at the control panel, aghast. "Electricity won't do it. Try sonic weapons." Luthor suggested with the calmness of a man cataloging failures. 2 sonic emitters hummed to life. A piercing wave hit Clark's ears. His eardrums, far more vulnerable than his skin, felt as if drums were being beaten inside his skull. He screamed, a raw, animal sound. Sweat poured off him. His vision blurred, the world pitched and rolled, and finally the last of his strength ebbed away. He could no longer fight. Superman, Where are you from in the universe? There's no record of you in any global database. You're a foreign invader, an advanced scout for conquest." Luther's voice flared. His certainty was ugly and narrow, like a man who needed an enemy to justify his fears. Clark, in agony, snapped back. "No, I'm not." Luther's eyes narrowed. He took that denial as confirmation of alien origin. "Interesting. You really are an alien." "Let me go," Clark shouted between ragged breaths. "What are you doing? I can't hear your heartbeat. I can't hear blood flowing through your veins." The comment made Sam pause. If there truly was no detectable heartbeat, if the man in the feed was silent and machine-like, then maybe they were dealing with something non-human. He reached for his pistol instinctively, an officer suddenly very small in a room full of unknowns. A squad captain burst in, breathless, clutching a radio. "General, soldiers in the city report an extremely fast unknown humanoid is heading toward the base." He glanced at Clark's live feed image. "It might be coming to rescue him." "David?" Clark's voice, suddenly stripped of pain and full of sharp hope, brightened. David was the one name that kept coming to mind, the only person he trusted like a brother. "Is he one of your kind? How many of you are on Earth?" Sam's features tightened. He grabbed the radio, ready to put fighter jets, tanks, and every unit on the highest state of readiness. Before he could give the order, the entire complex shook. Bang, bang, bang. Reinforced concrete exploded outward, rocks and dust filling the corridors. Dozens of thick walls meant to withstand heavy ordnance were smashed as if they were paper. In a heartbeat, a streak of purple lightning tore through the compound, a presence so fierce it shredded the surveillance feeds. David stood in the monitored room, a powerhouse of controlled fury. He found Clark in the electric chair, limp and beaten. The sight of him, bound and broken, darkened David's face. He turned to the camera, eyes hard as obsidian. "Curiosity is a fine trait," he said, voice low and dangerous. "But if you pry into certain secrets, you should be ready to pay the price." Chapter 106, Armor Zero. A thunderous roar, rocks blasted into the air. A figure tore through the military base with a display of raw power that left no doubt. This was no ordinary intruder. A familiar, angry voice rang out, followed by another, gentler one. "Are you all right?" David looked down at Clark, sweaty, disheveled, weak, and felt murder in his bones. He was sure the military had planned this. They'd come to arrest Clark on purpose. "Clark had just passed out," he said. Then the military, as if they'd known, arrived and sealed the whole place off. "I'm fine." Clark shook his head, trying to clear the dizziness. He forced a smile, but it was thin and strained. A metallic screech filled the air as David ripped through the nearly solid steel ball shackles holding Clark. 10-ton bindings were torn apart as if they were paper and tossed aside. Watching on the monitors, General Sam Lane and Rex went white. Another inhumanly powerful being. And he'd arrived at incredible speed. Could he be kin to Superman? One mutant might be explainable. Two suggested a species. Even Sam Lane found himself wondering if Clark really was an alien. "Can you walk?" David asked. Despite having smashed his way into a top-secret base, he had no urgency in his tone. He moved as if he were in his own backyard. Barely. Supported by David, Clark stumbled to his feet. He was weak. The sonic weapon and powerful sedatives had taken their toll. But walking was possible. "I'm getting out of here." David nodded and stepped toward the breach. Clark, blind to much of what was happening, hesitated and then said quietly, "If possible, brother, try not to kill anyone." As expected of Metropolis's hero, David replied dryly, "So kind." Clark managed a weak, pained smile. He'd been humiliated enough by being captured. Given how the sonic weapon had affected him, he wasn't confident he could have escaped on his own. Still, he didn't want David on a killing spree. Once David started, it would be one-sided bloodshed. "Don't worry," David said. "There won't be a single corpse today." He raised his hand and sent out an energy impact wave. The blast punched a man-sized hole straight through walls and tunnels, a violent surge of power that cut a path nearly half a mile long. A dozen base personnel caught behind a wall were vaporized. Then, in David's mind, not dead but simply absent. He told himself the missing bodies would be blamed on the military's own cover-ups. His parents would believe him, not the army that wanted to dissect their son. When Clark thought the words had convinced David, his face tightened. In the range of his super hearing, a dozen heartbeats had vanished. "Brother?" They were teleported, David said flatly, to another world. Soldiers rushed up, trampling through the wreckage with guns and cannons. Bullets swept toward them. David raised a hand, and a purple impact wave erased men from this world, one after another. Clark winced at the cold efficiency. He wasn't naive, but hearing his brother speak without emotion made him uneasy. "David, we should go," he begged. The distant wall's breach was blocked by the melted remains of an armored vehicle, the machine gun and its crew vaporized by a high-energy beam from David. A tank fired a shell. David pointed a single finger and detonated the warhead midair. When it exploded, a group of soldiers were shredded into bloody fragments. Others, wounded and crawling, screamed. Some convulsed and begged for mercy. "This is not a monster we can beat," someone shouted, and everyone began to feel they were facing death itself. Nearly 100 people had been killed or removed in minutes. Guns and cannons barely slowed David. Fear spread like a contagion. In the control room, General Sam Lane slammed his fist on the console and opened a secure channel. "Dr. Ians." In a dust-choked underground lab, a flustered doctor in a white coat answered. "What's happening in the base? Was there an earthquake? I'm hearing gunfire." This facility was no ordinary base. Sam had chosen it because it was a top-secret research hub full of advanced equipment and specialists. Superman had been scheduled to become another classified project here. Now something worse had shown up. "The base is under attack by a terrifying life form," Sam said, "possibly an alien terrorist. We need the Prometheus project. Get John ready. Connect him to the Zero battle armor and deploy him. Subdue the attacker and recapture the subject." "Alien terrorists?" Dr. Ian stared as if hearing a fairy tale. "General, the timeline says the Steel Warrior won't be safe to activate for at least 6 more months. If you force the armor now, Sergeant Corbin could suffer a fatal brain overload during the neural connection." "He's been training 5 years," Sam barked. "Qualified soldiers don't fear battle or death. I've already called John." On the screen, a heavy tank, over 100 tons, 200 millimeters of armor, was driven toward David and Clark. A single energy beam from David's hand sliced through the steel like it was tissue, turning the tank into molten scrap. Soldiers cowered as the figure finally emerged from a ruined room, bloodied men on the ground pleading for help, others scrambling to run, a faint soldier begging for more time he didn't have. "This is not a creature we can defeat," someone sobbed, and the staff trembled. Rex, watching the feed, rubbed his chin and said, "Steel Warrior?" Sam steeled himself and fixed Rex with a cold look. "Everything you just heard is top secret. You'll sign an NDA. If this leaks, you'll be charged with treason." Rex raised his hands in mock surrender and smiled. "Understood, General. But if this guy's physical strength is comparable to Superman's and his energy output exceeds Superman's, can your armored soldiers actually handle him in single combat?" On the monitor, the armor's supposed champions were failing. Soldiers fell one by one as David advanced, his purple beams and violent energy obliterating anything in his path. Sam's face burned with rage as he watched the glowing figure move. The Zero battle armor, forged from Promethean metal, the hardest substance on Earth and a classified military secret, was meant to be humanity's first defense against unknown invaders. It was supposed to be the safeguard that would protect civilization and, if needed, preserve its spark in the face of annihilation. Now, with a living nightmare loose inside the base, that hope was being rushed into use long before it was ready. "Sergeant Corbin, the neural interface will sting a little," Dr. Ians warned, sweat beading on his forehead as red alarm lights flashed around the lab. On the experimental platform, John Corbin stood with technicians helping him into a powerful suit of battle armor. The armor was all silver-gray metal, every inch armored except for his exposed head. He radiated the hard confidence of an elite soldier, one handpicked by General Lane, though a streak of arrogance flashed in his eyes. "Do you know what I've been through these last 5 years, Doctor?" he asked, a fierce smile cutting across his face. "I know," Dr. Ians said, wiping his brow. He'd helped design that brutal training regimen, meant not only to hone the body, but to temper the mind until it could bear the strain of the armor. "All right, proceed." They inserted neural implants into the back of Corbin's skull. He grunted, then a hungry, feral excitement lit his features. "I've trained for this for 5 years. I've been waiting. I heard Lois is obsessed with that Superman, always tracking him around Metropolis, trying to get a story. After today, Superman will be nothing but a streak in the sky, forgotten. As Lois Lane's childhood playmate, Corbin's long-held feelings showed through in the ferocity of his words. Now, connect the power. The base poured almost all of its stored electricity into the suit. Corbin seemed to become one with the armor. Sparks danced along the seams and leapt from his eyes. He roared as if being electrocuted. A technician watching his vitals stared at a tablet, alarm on his face. His heart, 150, 200. His heart's going to explode, another shouted. Stop! Save him! Several technicians started to rush forward. No, Corbin snarled, a touch of madness in his voice. I can feel it. He rose. His hands trembled with sensed power. The armor had become an extension of his body. I've never felt like this. He thought of the project's internal name, Prometheus, and laughed. If I were Prometheus, I wouldn't steal fire. I'd kill Zeus and take it for humanity. He snapped the helmet down and launched himself through the reinforced ceiling as if it had been paper. Thrusters kicked in, and he rocketed 100 meters into the night, whined screaming past. Inside the helmet HUD, his targeting system locked onto a single figure in the base, glowing with a purple aura. Energy flared from the suit's foot thrusters as he hurtled forward like a missile, metallic muscles bulging as he readied a crushing blow. A monster from another world, let me make you the first alien scum to fall to the zero battle armor. Careful, something's coming in fast, Clark said, eyes but alert, voice urgent as he warned his brother. To ease the suffering of soldiers badly wounded by missile strike, David lifted a hand to shift them to another world, then glanced upward. The armor wasn't bulky, it was lithe and fast, its tech at least on par with an early Iron Man mark. It tore through the sound barrier and slammed into the air over the base with unstoppable momentum. David flared the purple energy around his fist into a perfect sphere. He planted his feet and swung, meeting that metal fist head-on. The impact detonated like an explosion. Soldiers were lifted and scattered like straw. Armored vehicles skidded away as if they were toys. The shockwave cracked the earth itself, hurling concrete fragments and throwing up a surge of raw soil. A crater tens of meters wide opened where they struck. The whole base shuddered. Dust rained from the ceiling. Dr. Ians crawled back, staring at the hole Corbin had made. Corbin had survived the neural interface, but the doctor feared the 5 years of brutality had left his mind frayed. Clark's ears rang. The blast had thrown him back, toppling a forklift and leaving him disheveled. David, however, was fine. His physical resilience remained. He fixed his attention on the armor. Aside from the helmet, chest plate, gloves, and boots, the suit was composed of rippling metallic fibers, muscle-like, and it radiated oppressive solidity like an immovable mountain. Up close, it's nothing like the Mark II. The strength is on another level, David muttered. He looked at the steel gauntlet that had met his punch. It hadn't cracked, not even dented. David raised an eyebrow and delivered a blistering, lightning-fast kick that sent the nearly 2-meter-tall suit tumbling backward. He dug his fingers into the ground, scoring deep furrows to stop the momentum. Corbin stared down at the crater he'd made and at his hands, shaking with exhilaration. He felt invincible. What metal is this? David wondered. Its hardness rivals Amazon metal. He had read legends and dossiers. Eternium from the Legion, the ore used in Kryptonian tech, super metal that only Superman could soften with heat vision. None of them should be in a U.S. military program. And the way the armor had absorbed some of the energy from his punch hinted at something else. Promethean metal, an accidentally created alloy as unforgiving as mythic adamantium. Show me what you can do, alien scum, Corbin howled, charging like a battering ram and swinging a fist meant to sink warships. David's expression darkened at the slur. He met each blow with his bare body, answering steel with mountain-like force. The two of them traded impacts like titans, each collision throwing white shockwaves that swept and toppled everything nearby. Go! Get him! Someone shouted. Soldiers with rifles converged on Clark like wolves and tigers, closing in on the disoriented hero as the battle between metal and flesh threw the base into chaos. Chapter 108. Don't talk to yourself. This battle armor is powerful, but it doesn't look like it can match that life form. Lex Luthor watched the fight on the monitor and spoke without taking his eyes off the screen. Inside the base, tension had sliced through the air. Although the Zero battle armor and David were roughly similar in raw output, David clearly held the advantage. One simple strike from him forced the armor to give ground. It retreated, step by step. The Steel Warrior's capabilities are greater than that, General Sam Lane said, his face hard. According to the assessments, the Steel Warrior should have no trouble subduing Superman. If they hadn't needed half a year for a safe, stable neural interface test, they wouldn't have needed Lex involved at all. This one seems to have a stronger body than Superman, Lane continued, but the outcome won't change. If they were the same species, this man appeared more mature, stronger in ways Superman wasn't. Lane's confidence was blunt and edged with contempt. Flesh and blood can't contend with a steel construct. Even if he gets the upper hand briefly, it's only because John is not yet accustomed to the Zero battle armor. Biological bodies tire and break. The armor did not. So far, the Purple Light Man hadn't managed to scratch it. Once John Corbin got used to the controls and the armor reached full functionality, both of those suspected aliens would be taken. Lex frowned. "I don't want to sink this much into a dead end," he muttered. "Go. Catch him." Near the fighting area, the soldiers assumed Clark had only just risen, unsteady, weakened. Their plan was to overwhelm him. A rifle butt came down hard on his neck. Clark deflected it casually with the back of his hand. The soldier went flying several meters as if weightless, landing stunned. Men lunged forward with special restraints and were thrown aside as easily. More soldiers opened fire. Bullets shrieked through the air and shredded Clark's clothing, but his body didn't so much as bruise. He growled, charged through the fusillade, and with bare hands knocked every man down. It was a shocking display, someone taking bullets in a human body. But beside the battle between David and the Zero battle armor, Clark's struggle looked like a children's scuffle. Each of his blows sent shockwaves rolling out for dozens of meters. On the screen, the Zero battle armor's capabilities were alien, its systems beyond ordinary comprehension. But David faced it, and the terrifying kinetic force of its attacks was absorbed with ease. John Corbin's blows felt like hitting a bottomless ocean. He controlled the armor via neural interface. It was an extension of his limbs, but it still required time to master. "Are you playing with me, alien monster?" Corbin cursed into the link. He was certain his control over the armor had improved as the fight went on, that its systems were ramping up. Yet this man only grew stronger with every exchange. Even as Corbin had roughly doubled in effectiveness since the fight began, he still lagged behind. His voice was strained and furious, his fists battered like a storm, and every strike was parried. Most infuriating of all, David scarcely acknowledged him. David's attention drifted only to the armor itself, as if the machine alone deserved notice. The man inside it was beneath consideration. In this prototype, the Zero battle armor had no long-range weapons loaded. "We haven't found human tech capable of matching the armor's fist power. Aside from nuclear weapons," came a report from the underground control room. Dr. Irons watched the battle on the bank of monitors, jaw slack with disbelief. He'd thought the hardest part was getting John's neural link to work. Once that was solved, the alien threat would be controllable, but the armor's punches, the ones that toppled skyscrapers, looked soft and ineffectual against their opponent. It didn't even make him flinch. If conventional weapons produced no effect, what then? Do we call in nuclear strikes regardless of the fallout? Irons wondered, horror in his voice. The scene suggested all human armaments could be meaningless against this stranger. He could wreak havoc in any major city if he wanted. If the species had many like him, conquest of this planet would be child's play. Irons silently prayed the figure was not truly alien. If Diana, before she awakened her bloodline power and without the God-Killer sword, had to face this armor, she would have a brutal fight, he said. Back on the battlefield, David's brow creased as the Zero battle armor launched another furious assault. With a kinetic burst comparable to thousands of tons of TNT, the silver-gray suit dove, its legs gouging 2 trenches more than 10 meters long into the concrete. Propulsors spat flame as Corbin surged forward like a berserker, his steel fists tearing at the earth. 2 purple energy rays cut the sky toward David. "It's useless. Your energy can't hurt me." Corbin shouted, spurring the armor through the heat and whatever impact it met to reach David and hammer down with a fist. David accepted the blow without emotion. The force sent him flying, but it didn't overcome him. Corbin in the zero battle armor had the strength to level a country, and yet against David, who had finally grown serious, he was as impotent as a mantis against a chariot. A purple sheen that clung to the armor's surface simply vanished as if absorbed. Seeing the effect again, David registered one more fact. The suit was made of Promethean metal. Promethean metal, also called Promethium, was a creation of Steve Dayton, one of the wealthiest men in their world. It was an almost indestructible alloy, rumored to be a mysterious mix of titanium and vanadium. Parts of Cyborg were made from it. The armor's composition didn't surprise him so much as interest him. David used no weapons. He relied on his own strength and abilities. He bided his time with John Corbin's tireless assaults, waiting for an opening. Then, with a single clean strike, a fist of flesh and blood came down like a falling mountain. The ground in a dozen-meter radius shattered and collapsed. Corbin was hammered toward the earth, knees buckling, teeth clenched as he barely checked the blow. He snarled at the face shrouded in purple light. This armor was made to eliminate every alien threat to Earth. I am your ultimate weapon. If I can't beat you, what was the point of 5 years of brutal training and this priceless suit? He shoved David away with both armored arms and launched himself forward like a cannonball, head first into David's chest. Alien monster, none of your objectives will succeed. David's response was casual and cutting. He reached out a hand and absorbed the kinetic energy of the headlong charge, then slammed Corbin back into the ground. Corbin thrashed, trying to rise. Don't talk to yourself, David said flatly. Arbitrarily calling people aliens and making it sound like conspiracy? Are you paranoid? A fist like a meteor fell and struck Corbin's helmet, driving him back into the pit. Corbin roared, furious and wounded. Did you forget who started all this? He bellowed. Placeholder. I attempted to retrieve Chapter 109 from http://en/I am the younger brother of Superman, but I got the template of that I got the Chapter 109, but the fetch failed. Error fetching hrb.com, then API's reader/get. Network error. Failed to fetch. Chapter 110. Faster integration. After graduating high school, David had learned from Chloe that Lois Lane was her cousin. He figured Clark would eventually go to Metropolis and might meet Lois, so he looked her up online. I accidentally stumbled on a news piece about the Daily Planet's rising star, Lois Lane, he told himself, and the article included a photo of General Sam Lane. David only glanced at the picture twice, but his eidetic memory held it clearly. If Sam Lane were killed, what would that mean for Clark and Lois if they ever got together? It wasn't his problem to solve, not yet. Still, he muttered under his breath, I think this should be enough for you to remember, General Sam Lane, and left it at that. In the end, David didn't kill the general. He grabbed him, forced him to face David's heat vision, warned him with a terrifying blast of high temperature, and then dumped him onto the cold ground. There won't be a next time, he said before walking away. The burnt scent hung in the air. The shaken general watched him disappear as if from his own backyard, pale and teeth gritted, the warning voice still echoing in the room. David pulled Clark out of the wrecked military base and brought him home. The doorbell rang. Mother, David said, smiling with relief. He and Clark stood on the porch. Clark looked exhausted and pale but alive. Martha crossed herself and nearly fainted with relief when she saw both sons. Clark, are you all right? She cried. Jonathan hurried Clark inside and helped him onto the sofa. Clark offered a weak smile. I'll be fine. They gave me a sedative. I'll be okay after I sleep. David handed him a glass of water. If there had been daylight, a few seconds in the sun would have healed him completely, but night made things take longer. Clark drank the water in big, thirsty gulps and then looked at his parents with shame. I'm sorry I didn't tell you about what I do, he said quietly. He'd expected his parents to be proud, and seeing the distress they'd been in after the TV news showed him taken by the military filled him with remorse. Jonathan squeezed his son's shoulder. We're proud of you, Clark, he said. I've always believed you were brought here for a purpose. You use your gifts to help people. How many families have you saved? You've given people hope. There's nothing to be sorry for, Martha added, tears in her eyes. If you use your powers to help others, Jonathan and I won't stop you. Clark winced. If it hadn't been for David today, I don't know how I'd have gotten out. He gave a bitter laugh, thinking about what his younger brother had done in the base. He would have preferred if fewer people had been hurt during the rescue, but he couldn't say that with their parents in the room. Jonathan hugged David, overwhelmed with relief that the boy had broken into a military facility to save his brother. The family embraced, exhausted but grateful. Later, after they'd calmed their parents, the brothers went upstairs to their rooms. Standing in the doorway between them, both feeling the strain of the night, David said quietly, "You were targeted. Be more careful from now on. I don't want to see you strapped to an electric chair in a military base again." Clark rubbed the back of his neck. I know. He'd been rescued again by his younger brother. He should have been the one protecting David. David didn't bring up everything he'd learned. He lay on his bed staring at the ceiling, thinking. He hoped Clark had taken the lesson to heart. Superman's greatest weakness, he believed, was kindness. If Clark weren't so soft-hearted, if he kept a healthy guard, many of his setbacks could be avoided. Speed and heat vision could make him unstoppable. Villains exploited his compassion instead of having to match him physically. If he ever changes into someone else, David thought, he's no longer the Superman we know. But he also hoped Clark would learn to be cautious without losing himself. News of the rescue spread fast. David's brief appearance at the military blockade, the purple glow that had surrounded him, his obscured face, his forceful threats, set Metropolis buzzing. People called him the Purple Light Man. Online, forums and social feeds filled with speculation. Did he come to save Superman? One headline asked. What's his relationship to Superman? Another wondered. Some feared him. Will he be a threat to the city or the world? Others were intrigued. First Superman, then the Purple Light Man. How many people like this are out there? Rumors ran wild about whether he'd been fighting the army or something else during that half hour of chaos outside the city. By morning, every paper had picked up the story. Superman rescues citizens, collapses, is taken by the military. Mysterious Purple Light Man appears. Friend or foe? The Metropolis Life Daily asked. David sat on the balcony in a lounge chair with that very paper, raising an eyebrow at the headline. Even the Life Daily, which usually ignores this sort of thing, covered us. People are curious, he said. Clark came out with a cup of coffee, leaned on the railing, and grinned at his brother. You should join me. Be my partner. You're stronger than me. He teased, but he meant it. If David wanted to help people, he'd do well at it. I'm not interested, David replied after a shrug, then put the paper down and looked toward the distant farm where he'd been spending his break. My vacation time's almost over. I need to focus on the next trip. He checked a small control panel on a device he'd been using. The merge progress bar blinked across the screen. He frowned. The percentage was climbing faster than expected. Is this merge abnormal? Why's the number jumping so quickly? He muttered, watching the indicator with a rising edge of concern and curiosity. David wasn't interested in Clark's proposal. He only wanted to protect his family. He had no intention of becoming some Superman-like figure, rushing off to help strangers, being constantly misunderstood and suspected, or occasionally subjected to moral blackmail. And besides, he said, put everything else aside. You've always hated the way I do things. Clark frowned. I'm worried that if that vigilante group forms, you'll end up at odds with me. I won't stand by and let you put yourself or others at risk. David stood up from the lounge chair and looked at him. I don't want Mom and Dad to have to see us fight each other. He put a hand on Clark's shoulder. So, no thanks. Clark, holding a cup of coffee, went quiet for a moment. His brother had broken into a military base to save him, and Clark had tried to keep David from hurting any of the soldiers who'd fired on him. He'd kept wanting to leave quickly with David to stop more bloodshed. Maybe he'd been too protective. Remember Lex Luthor? He asked. I do. David sounded distant. Clark sat up. He'd saved Lex once. If not for a truck Lex had given him, Clark might never have learned as much about his own identity. Lex hasn't been seen around town lately. His father, Lionel Luthor, was in a car crash a while back. Lex took over the company. He's probably overwhelmed with the business. Clark's sympathy was faint. "I'm not asking about the newspapers." David shook his head. Luther's situation yesterday had been stranger than the news suggested. He was a technological genius. His power armor would have been formidable if it hadn't faced Superman. But the bionic figure they'd seen at the base, almost alarmingly lifelike and far beyond known human tech, couldn't have been the work of a young Luther alone. "You had all night to think it over. You should be able to see that what happened yesterday wasn't just random, it was a setup." David told Clark what he'd seen. "I saw Luther at the base. I think he was the brains behind it. He used the lives on that train as bait to lure you into a trap." Clark's brow tightened. "The voice over the loudspeaker sounded familiar," he said. "Even distorted, I think it." He stopped. Thinking back, the tone had matched Lex's. He'd been 10/10ths sure. There had been nearly 1,000 people on that train. To use them as bait, especially after Clark had saved Lex, felt like betrayal. But it wasn't him in person at the base. No heartbeat, no blood. Whatever it was couldn't have been alive. "That was a robot," David confirmed. Clark looked at him. "What do you want me to do?" "Keep an eye on Luther." Clark had made threats yesterday. He'd said he'd consign Luther to the shadows. If he shows up in public as a robot, take him out. Clark didn't like the sound of cold-blooded kill orders, but letting Luther parade around in a deadly mechanical body was intolerable. "No problem," he said. When asked to do something, Clark was quick to agree. Then his face grew serious. "But this might be more complicated. If Luther actually planted bombs or rigged things at the base, I'll find the evidence and throw the book at him." David was pessimistic. "Don't expect it to be easy. The military was involved." Clark fell silent. He knew how messy things became when official agencies were involved: judges, jurisdiction, bureaucratic machinery. "Speaking of the military, before I head out, I need to visit someone," David murmured, thinking. The Promethean metal they'd found, the transformable alloy, could grant people superhuman abilities. He glanced toward the house, his expression shifting. "Who?" In Mexico, on a quiet lakeshore in the southeast A4 zone, a 5-story modern villa sat like a white disk beside the water, streamlined, immaculate, and bristling with tech. Elite bodyguards in black moved through the lakeside foliage with hunting dogs, earpieces whispering updates. The security rivaled that of a small nation's head of state. The owner was Steve Dayton, one of the richest industrialists in the world, a man whose businesses touched defense, medicine, automotive, and rocketry. His labs were famous and feared. Inside one underground facility, Steve Dayton looked exhausted, like a man who hadn't slept in days. His hair stuck up in a messy tangle, and dark circles framed his eyes. It didn't match the dapper, aggressive energy he usually carried in public. Still, he was aglow with a manic kind of triumph. "It's done," he said, taking off his goggles and staring at the helmet on the workbench as if it were a crown. The silver titanium alloy headpiece looked at first like an oversized ski helmet, but Steve knew the secrets hidden in its seams. He'd worked into the night soldering microfilaments, integrating neural interfaces and exotic alloys. "Put this on, and it enhances brain function, amplifies mental energy, telepathy, mind control, heightened cognition." He felt both dizzy and elated. He drank from a glass of water, wiped his mouth, and, with trembling hands, reached for the helmet. "Steve Dayton, you not only have a formidable business mind, you might be a rare inventor too," a young, magnetic voice said. Steve startled as if a rabbit had tapped his shoulder. He snapped his head around. A slim figure leaned against the wall, arms folded and watching him with casual interest. He didn't wear a mask, yet an aura of deep purple light seemed to radiate from him, bathing the lab in a faint sheen. To Steve's bewilderment, the visitor looked like nothing more than a man leaning in a corridor, as if this secret multi-million-dollar underground lab were just another storefront. "You," Steve began. "Who are you?" "Purple Light Man," the stranger replied, almost amused. The name was nonsensical, but the purple glow made it stick. Steve's pupils narrowed. He almost reached for the last resort, a panic button, but instead he slapped the newly finished helmet on his head and flicked a switch. A red glow pulsed from the helmet's seams. Sweat beaded at Steve's temples. He forced a brittle smile and tried to use the helmet's neural amplifier to read the man's mind. If this was the monster who'd taken down a military base and beaten a Zero armor suit, What was he after? Instantly, Steve felt pressure behind his eyes, as if he were straining to lift something heavy. He pushed harder. Sweat ran down his cheeks. Nothing. No coherent thoughts, no signals to latch onto. His face crumpled. Did the amplifier fail? He muttered under his breath. Impossible. The purple-lit man watched him with mild interest. You do realize I only appeared in public yesterday, he said. You've always had an eye for the supernatural, haven't you? Steve's hand trembled. He tried again, harder, but a headache flared. The helmet's readout spun and stuttered. He couldn't parse a single clear thought from the visitor. No emotions, no images. It was as if the man were wrapped in a cloak that blocked everything. Your helmet's fine, the man said casually. It's just too weak. Steve's face went ashen. He had poured years and almost everything he owned into this project. Failure was unbearable. Too weak? He echoed, incredulous. The purple glow pulsed slightly, like a heartbeat. The man, David, smiled, not unkindly. You're on the right track, but if you're trying to amplify the mind to control people, you'll need more than hardware. Chapter 112. Template Fusion completed. David's resistance to psionic intrusion was off the charts. The psionic amplification helmet Steve Dayton had invented simply didn't work on him. With a soft whoosh, David's outline blurred and the helmet materialized in his hand. Steve's head went blank for a moment. He reached up and couldn't feel the helmet he'd just been wearing. When he looked and saw it in David's grip, a cold sweat ran down his spine. Steve Dayton, the creator of Promethean metal, had been dragged into partnered projects with the military after they discovered his alloy. He'd already seen footage of that purple light figure ripping apart Promethean metal armor and cutting down everything in its path. He knew what kind of monster stood in front of him now. With that speed, he could pluck his head off like a roadside flower before he even had time to react. I was trying to figure out how to get you to hand over the Promethean formula, Steve blurted, stepping back as if away from a predator. David weighed the helmet in his hand and chuckled. Seems you helped me with that. Steve went pale. In the comics, billionaire Steve Dayton became the superhero mentor after inventing that helmet. He'd been obsessed with keeping the Promethean formula secret. This metal absorbed infinite energy and could trigger a global crisis if it leaked. Few in the military even knew about it. How could David possibly know? That's none of your concern, David said, and then, without preamble, put the helmet on. A vast psionic field expanded outward, filling the lab. An invisible mental tide washed over Steve. His mind felt like a tiny boat on a boundless ocean, buffeted and dragged. David's voice was calm. What's the formula for Promethean metal? You'll never know, Steve snarled through clenched teeth. Even if this thing was strong enough to be wounded only by nuclear blasts, Steve would not be the one to hand over the recipe. The more people who knew the formula, he reminded himself, the more likely it was to leak and cause catastrophe. David watched him a moment and then began to recite, almost conversationally, under high temperature and high pressure, 33.1% vanadium, 59.7% titanium, 4.2% palladium, 2.3% rhodium. Steve went white. The words he had guarded like a state secret were being spoken back to him. Consumable type or mutable type? David asked quietly. Steve's face drained of color. The helmet let David access more than just surface thoughts, images, instincts, the first silly associations that flash through someone's mind. He hadn't answered the question aloud, but David read the answer from his subconscious. So you found Promethean metal by accident, David said, putting the pieces together. Compared to a metal that could rival divine forged materials in hardness, absorb limitless energy, and grant powers, Steve's helmet was a child's toy. He could have built armor or given himself abilities using Promethean metal, yet he hadn't, because he'd stumbled onto it while researching an aerospace alloy and called it luck instead of genius. Shut up, Steve snapped. Pride kept him from explaining the truth out loud. David kept pressing. What's the formula for the mutable type? Steve's deeper reactions betrayed him again. David was already inside his head. The mutable variant, he learned, required a slightly different process, lower pressure, higher temperature, yet the base composition remained the same. David's tone went softer. One last question. How do you make mutable Promethean metal bestow powers on people? Steve tried to cover his ears as images of profit and reports flooded his mind. He tried to flee for his security team, but under David's influence he froze, hands falling to his sides. "Answer," David said. "Cut it open," Steve heard himself say, as if speaking through someone else's mouth. "The more severe the injury, the better. Implant the metal. It's best if the subject has a strong will to endure the awakening." The brutal method made David frown. Between the blood and the need for ironclad resolve, it wasn't suitable for his parents. Still, the mutable metal would be invaluable for giving others self-preservation through powers, if there were a less barbaric way someday. "Do you have any mutable stock here? Bring me some," David ordered. Under mental control, Steve walked to a man-high safe, opened it, and carried out several cans of the mutable alloy. He moved like a puppet until David released him. Half a minute later, Steve blinked back to himself, standing at the workbench. A silver helmet lay before him. "Oh, right, time to test the helmet," he thought, brightening. He reached for it, then hesitated, a nagging feeling of forgetfulness prickling him. He'd been running on fumes for days. No, everything was fine. But he did notice suddenly a deep unease. He'd felt his thoughts twisted, shadows of darker moods slithering through his head. Unknown to him in that moment, the helmet carried insidious side effects. Each use warped the mind, twisting moral centers and dragging a user toward darker urges. It was by such small steps that, in the future the comics hinted at, Steve Dayton would become the crime lord, using Promethean metal to create superpowered operatives and build the villainous organization known as the Hybrid. Meanwhile, David had left the lab without taking the helmet. He moved quickly and quietly, a backpack heavy with cans of mutable Promethean metal on his shoulders, cutting across a rugged stretch of Mexico. He paused on the trail as a warm surge filled him, and the expression on his face shifted. Black King template merging. Loading new template. Another pulse, a clean, bright heat behind his eyes. The second template finished locking into place. David's eyes flared with a new light. Chapter 113. The planet beneath my feet is my weapon. What will the third template be? David's eyes burned with anticipation, nervous and excited at the same time. Third template loading. Loading 3, 20%. A few seconds later, amid his racing heart, a buzzing sound echoed in his skull. He shook his head and a strange force surrounded him. He looked out into the void and something vast, intangible, and omnipresent that he had never sensed before opened to him. He stood in a green wilderness of overgrown weeds where unknown insects chirped. He looked down at the ground and felt his fingers twitch. Pebbles at his feet rose as if grabbed by an invisible hand. Whoosh! David's eyes flashed. The stones shot forward like sniper rounds, piercing a large tree dozens of meters away. With another motion, the hundreds of pounds backpack on his back floated down and hit the ground. And not just that. He closed his eyes to sense it more deeply. The feeling sharpened. A boundless, immense field enveloped the planet. David felt like an ant brushing against an ocean, and the most astonishing part was that he could borrow and control the power of that ocean. Buzz, he opened his eyes. The air around him seemed compressed under immense pressure, growing intense. Crack, crack, crack! Weeds that had been swaying were pressed flat to the ground. The insects uttered mournful cries that quickly died away. Tree branches groaned and then snapped, crashing down. An invisible force spread for miles around him. Whoosh! His feet left the ground, and David rose like a god ascending to the heavens. Pebbles circled him like planetary rings as he climbed. Sunlight bathed his face, ancient and sculpted, in a golden glow that lent him a touch of divinity. Between clouds and sky newly able to fly, he opened his eyes and looked down at the tiny wilderness below. A surge of grandeur filled him, a feeling of unbounded freedom, as if the world were his playground. To fly freely like a bird, that's been humanity's dream since ancient times. And now he had done it. He had conquered the sky, escaped gravity's bondage. More precisely, I manipulate gravity. Clenching his fist, he felt as if he gripped an invisible world. A fierce light flared in his eyes. The new template's power revealed itself. Gravity, the omnipresent force filling every corner of the planet yet often overlooked, was now his to command. Graviton template loading complete, 30% fused. Graviton? David raised an eyebrow and rummaged his memory. He recalled a villain with a similar name to Magneto. The two were comparable. One dominated magnetism and electromagnetism, the other dominated gravity and universal gravitation. Graviton Franklin Hall was a physicist who gained gravity control in a particle accelerator accident and later became a major adversary of the Avengers. Background on Graviton flooded his mind. In the same generation as Magneto, his power rivaled Magneto's and sometimes exceeded it under normal circumstances. He's beaten the Avengers multiple times, once even defeating Hulk, Thor, and Scarlet Witch together. His failures usually came from instability, a fragile mind that sabotaged his own goals or left openings others exploited. It was a case of software letting the hardware down. David, however, didn't share that weakness. Getting accustomed to his new power, he snapped his fingers and the backpack on the ground floated over. He pointed toward a mountain peak 800 or 900 meters high, several miles away. Me! At the mountain's base, an old shepherd in a white hat, a cross on his hand, drove goats with a whip. The flock jumped between crags, nibbling grass. Rumble, the earth trembled, rocks tumbled, and the peak shuddered. An earthquake? The shepherd looked up in alarm. Then his jaw dropped at a sight he'd never forget. As if an invisible giant had grabbed the mountain, the seam between its base and the earth tore apart, and the whole peak was yanked free, hovering dozens of meters into the air. The sheep bleated and scattered. The shepherd froze, dumbstruck, trembling with shock. "Oh God, what have I seen?" He rubbed his eyes, but nothing changed. The peak hovered above the ground. "Is this real?" Struck like lightning, the shepherd dropped to his knees, praying, small and helpless before such raw power. After more than 10 seconds, David eased the gravitational field and set the mountain back in place. He looked at his palm, lifting a mountain that was roughly the limit of his current control. Immersed in the thrill of his new strength, he didn't notice the shepherd below, who, seeing the mountain settle, thought God had simply played a trick on him. To reshape lunar craters like Graviton in the comics, to lift islands or cities into the sky at will, David thought, I'll need a higher fusion rate. Even so, this boost dramatically increased his strength. With a wave of his hand, he could raise mountains, split the earth, and alter terrain. Excitement showed on his face as he compared abilities. Magneto and Graviton, only one letter's difference, were often held up against each other. Compared to magnetism, gravity is far more versatile. It manipulates everything in the world, not just metal, and it's easier to control. On ultimate potential, electromagnetism is far stronger than gravity among the fundamental forces, but David felt that a hard upper limit wasn't always relevant. With gravity control, there are many extensions: bending light to see distant objects, perceiving things across oceans through gravitational sensing, negating gravity, creating fields that pull everything together, building gravitational shields, causing earthquakes, firing gravity beams. Many of those feats reached into universal gravitation and were beyond him now. But the basic truth remained: inside the range of a gravitational field, he could manipulate almost everything like a god. The planet beneath my feet is my weapon. Bang, bang, bang! A series of sonic booms cracked through the sky like taut white sheets tearing, leaving trailing vaporous clouds. By manipulating and deflecting Earth's gravitational influence on himself, David pushed into flight and broke through cloud cover. 10 times the speed of sound, 50, 100, 200. In a few dozen seconds, he accelerated to 200 times the speed of sound, his limit approaching around 260 times. A gravitational field wrapped him, protecting his clothing. He laughed, streaking across the heavens like a meteor. I used to worry about moving at the bottom of the deep sea. Pressure and water resistance crippled every action and weakened attacks. He thought of Atlantis, where he was headed. But now, none of that matters. He returned home and slid the variable Promethean metal he'd taken under his bed. He wasn't sure what to do with it yet. The process of gaining powers from it was bloody, brutal, and a test of will, so he decided to save it for later. After leaving home, he stopped by Paradise Island to make sure the Amazon warriors weren't slacking off. His presence alone was a silent reminder to keep them in line. Then he set out to find Atlantis in the North Sea, diving into the cool, blue water. Enveloped in an oval gravity field, David floated through the sea as fish drifted past. He closed his eyes and felt the pulse of the planet under his feet. Through the planet's gravity, he could sense conditions across the vast waters. The seven kingdoms of the sea, called kingdoms but really only a few cities scattered through the seven seas, were like needles in a haystack to anyone searching by conventional means. Fortunately, he had learned to manipulate gravity. Reading the planet's gravity was like getting sonar in his mind. Silent, colorless images flashed, showing thousands of miles with the clarity of lines on his palm. He scanned for traces of cities. While he worked, another thought nagged at him. An anomaly had shown up before the Black King template fully merged. Actually, it's only the last day or two, he thought. The template fusion rate jumped more than I'd expected. At first, he'd wondered if something had happened on Paradise Island, some secret revolt or a large gathering stoking resentment toward him. But there was nothing. When had the abnormal increase started? Was it when he revealed himself publicly, attacked the military base outside Metropolis, and rescued Clark, events that had shocked and inflamed public opinion? What was the connection? He'd always assumed ordinary people couldn't provide him with emotional points, but maybe he was wrong. Then the outline of a high-tech underwater city snapped into view. Found it, the seven kingdoms of the sea. He set his doubts aside. First, secure what was certain, he told himself, then worry about the rest. The water around him seemed to come alive, pushing against his gravity shield and driving him forward through the sea at high speed. As he surged toward the city, he heard a voice. Princess. A magnificent palace of what looked like living crystal rose before him. Inside, a middle-aged man with a hooked nose entered and bowed, hand to chest. Vulko, you're here again, a woman's voice replied. Mera, princess of Zibel, sat like a merperson carved from living coral, wearing armor of green scales that clung to her. She turned her head slightly, brows knotted, and did not look especially pleased to see the elder who had once taught her. This is different, Princess Mera, Vulko said, eyes bright as he clutched an ancient scroll. Mera rose. Her red hair flowed like a curtain of coral in the water. Aren't you here again to persuade me to help the Queen's eldest son, Arthur, claim the throne? She asked. She had loved the late Queen like a mother. The Queen had taught her, shaped her. The years in Atlantis had been the happiest of her life, and when her father later founded the Kingdom of Zebel and she became its princess, she had tried to hold on to that freedom. But she had never met Arthur. She had no reason to help him overthrow her father's chosen betrothed, Orm, the current king of Atlantis. Vulko cut to the core. Your father pushed you toward Prince Orm to secure power over the seven seas. He never considered your happiness. He meant that if Mera became queen of Atlantis, her father, the king of Zibel, who hid his ambition beneath a benevolent face, would gain supremely influential power across the seas. Orm himself was not without ambition. If not tempered by ancient custom, he might swell to war and annex Zebel. Mera's eyes flickered with conflict. I cannot betray my people, she said. This time is different, Vulko urged. He hurried to a crystal table and unrolled the scroll, excitement making him fumble. He'd tried to persuade her before, and always failed, but now there might be a chance to fulfill the late Queen's last wish. Atlanteans despised land dwellers, and the Queen's eldest son, Arthur, had a lighthouse keeper for a father, half land dweller blood. Without a strong faction behind him, he could not claim the throne. Do you remember the lost trident of Atlantis? Vulko asked. Mera glanced at the scroll, surprised. A golden trident gleamed from the center of the old parchment. That legend? She murmured. Vulko shook his head. Not a legend, not really. Because the tale is so old, our people call it a myth, but the royal records say it was once history. The greatest smith of Atlantis forged the trident for the first king from Poseidon's cold iron. The legends say it grants the power to rule the ocean. Mera recalled the old whispers. Whoever wins its favor secures supreme, absolute rule over the seven seas. All Atlanteans must bow to them. The latter half of that is the indisputable symbol of imperial power, Vulko said, his voice low. But in our hunger for it, in the experiments to unlock its power, Atlantis suffered an accident. Our civilization was destroyed, and the trident vanished when the first king exiled himself. He glanced around, then produced a rusty cylindrical object from behind his waist. Not long ago, our archaeologists found this at the old site. It's an ancient recorder from the First Dynasty, he said. It contains the last message the first king of Atlantis left for his people. Follow it, and you can find the trident." As Volko finished, the water in the room suddenly moved like a hand, pulling the recorder from his grasp. For a moment, he thought Mara had been convinced and was reaching for it. He smiled and called, "Princess Mara." But Mara's face was stunned. The small cylinder hovered, cradled by the water, and she took a step back. Her hands were empty, and her expression was one of genuine shock. This wasn't me," she said. Chapter 115, Go Back and Tell Your King. It wasn't Mara who did it. Who else among the Atlanteans could command water like that? Volko reacted instantly, lunging to snatch back the recorder that might hold clues to the sacred trident. But the water seized the device like a giant hand and swept it to a figure standing nearby. A man with a slim, sculpted build, handsome like an ancient Greek statue, caught the recorder with one slow, deliberate motion. "A trident that could make Atlantis submit if one were to gain its recognition," he said. "Who are you?" Mara demanded, on edge like a startled fish. Water spun into a vortex beneath her palms, ready to strike. This was her bedchamber, the private quarters of Zebel's princess, not a place for strangers to stroll through. How had someone appeared here so casually? David glanced past her to the guards by the door. Several lay unconscious where the water had knocked them out. "Give it back," Volko barked, charging with a clenched fist. That recorder embodied his last hope of fulfilling the late queen's final wish. Volko wasn't of royal blood, but his lineage carried a certain nobility, and his strength was legendary, greater than a blue whale's, he liked to joke. He launched forward like a torpedo, ripples of water trailing behind him. David merely watched. The gravity in the water intensified abruptly. Volko was thrown down with a heavy crack. The palace floor splintered like a spiderweb beneath him. He landed with his head bowed to the marble, unable to move. Pain and disbelief flickered across his face. "Who are you?" he forced out. David ignored the question. Water coiled like a python and lashed at him. Seeing the elder who had taught her to fight pinned to the floor, Mara's heart tightened, and she attacked the intruder without hesitation. She could shape water, change its density and hardness. She could make the faintest current cut through steel. Yet when she struck, David lifted a hand, and her water collapsed into nothing. "Impossible," she breathed, staring at her useless hands. Another invisible well of pressure spread outward. Under the sudden weight, the water surged, and Mara was driven to her knees. Humiliated and struggling, she tried to rise, but it was like several mountains pressing her down. "Don't struggle," David said calmly. He toyed with the recorder for a moment, then crushed it in his palm. Fragments floated away in the seawater. "No," Volko cried. "What have you done? That was our only clue to the sacred trident." He strained to move but could not. The one lead that might have secured Arthur's claim to the throne was gone. Mara, hair disheveled and fury flashing across her face, glared at David. If he had not come to find clues to the trident, what had brought him here? "Why destroy it?" she demanded. "This recorder is useless to me," David said. "I already know where the trident is. I simply haven't needed it, so I didn't go fetch it." Volko's face froze. The recorder pointed to a lost kingdom, one of Atlantis' 7 undersea realms, once a palace ruin, scattered across what had become Sahara Desert when the sea receded. From there, it directed a seeker to a bottle in Sicily, to place that bottle on the statue of Rome's first emperor and peer out from its mouth to find the final location, a trench near the Trench clan. The sacred trident lay there. David destroyed the recorder, not because he lacked the information, but to keep others from following him. He didn't want his treasure hunt interrupted. Mara let out a cold, incredulous laugh from her knees. "You expect me to believe that?" David's response was a single raised eyebrow. Water formed a hand around Mara's throat and lifted her with effortless ease. "Let me go," she spat. She fought with everything she had, but the water grip felt like an alloy of unimaginable density. Her attacks were feeble by comparison. Captured like a bird, she was brought to David's side. "Go back and tell Orm," he said. "I've taken his fiancée. Tell him to gather all of Atlantis." Ignoring her frantic struggles, he looked down at Volko and added, "When I return, Atlantis will have a new king." Volko pushed himself up, chest heaving. "Release Princess Mara," he screamed. David carried Mera by the water hand and rose, moving out of the palace where guards were already swarming, spears raised. He flicked a hand, and a pulse of gravity threw a dozen elite soldiers backward like rubber balls, sending them hurtling through walls. It was the same strategy he had used on Paradise Island: rule and leave the people resentful but helpless. Even the wisest king cannot occupy the minds of his subjects every day, he thought, but humiliated, oppressed people will always wish their tyrant dead. He didn't need to be their tyrant, only to plant that seed of helplessness. A squad of riders on shark-like steeds charged, spears and rifles at the ready. David didn't even look back. Wave after wave of gravitational force rippled from him. In the water-filled city, the impacts were like earthquakes. Atlantean warriors were flung aside as if the sea itself had risen. Buildings shuddered. Citizens looked up in terror and saw a single figure flying off into the distance, carrying their princess like some unstoppable god. None could catch him. Mera, too stunned to keep fighting, stared at the man in land-dweller clothes who held such terrifying power. The king of Zebel, having been alerted, surged out on a massive seahorse and gave chase, while Volko staggered from Mera's palace, clutching his ribs. "Volko, what happened?" the king demanded, suspicion flashing in his eyes as he took in the scene. David did not slow. He had already left the capital of Campbell behind, and now pushed his speed far beyond caution. Even in the crushing pressures of the deep, where steel might fail, he accelerated until his velocity was an astonishing multiple of sound. He glanced back at the retreating city. "I've shown them a taste of my power, and I left them a message. By the time I come back with the trident, Orm and Mera's father will have called every Atlantean they can and formed their lines." That would make his task easier in one decisive move. As for Mera herself, well, she would be the story's main figure for now, but David felt little personal animosity. He thought the resentment people felt toward her shouldn't be exaggerated because of a certain actress. The character of Mera was created in the 1960s. Long before that actress's mother was even born, Mera had already been a popular female hero in American comics. Chapter 116. You are too arrogant, land-dweller David, clutching Mera, whose disappearance would surely touch both kingdoms, broke free of the sea and shot upward. A dark shape pierced the ocean like a missile, driving up a towering column of water that arced into the sky. For a moment the world hung suspended, then David activated an elliptical gravity field around them. Enclosed in that gravity well, they shot outward like an intercontinental rocket, accelerating relentlessly until their speed topped 200 times the speed of sound. He glanced down at Mera, who was still thrashing. David released his grip. She fell, eyes wide with terror, expecting to smash into the ocean 1,000 meters below. Instead, she hit a firm barrier with a thud. Dazed, she tried to push herself up and banged her head on the inside of the field. "Don't move. If you fall, I'm not catching you," David said, looking at her as if she were a fool. The field was sleek and streamlined, shuttle-shaped, and filled the space so that standing up inside it was awkward. Outside, the blue sky and white clouds streaked past in a blur, melting into a chaotic wash of color as if paint had been flung across the horizon. "At least 100 times the speed of sound," Mera managed, her face betraying her shock. She could move at supersonic speeds underwater, and her reflexes were far quicker than any land dwellers, yet she couldn't begin to match David's velocity, nor could she even see it clearly. The memory of how he had seized her and left Zebel flared through her mind. She had never suspected this man could be so powerful. Her whole body went rigid as she stared up at David, who kept his eyes fixed on the path ahead. Below them was the empty sky. For a long minute, she dared not make a sudden move. If the field failed, she thought, she would streak through the air and hit sea or land at unimaginable speed, and be nothing more than a smear. Still, she was uncomfortable with how they were positioned inside the field, one above the other. David never glanced at her. Finally, she forced herself to speak. "Who are you?" "I am Princess of Zebel, fiancée of the King of the Seven Seas. If you abduct me, you could plunge the whole world into war." David turned the corner of his mouth into a small smile. "You keep calling me a land dweller. How do you know I'm not Atlantean?" Mera's eyes narrowed. The old Atlanteans had originated on land. After sinking, different groups evolved. Some, like the brine in the trench, mutated beyond recognition. Others, like the fishmen, became a hybrid of human and fish. Atlanteans themselves were essentially human in form, only adapted to breathe and live underwater. "Do you think I'm that easy to fool? Land dweller," she sneered. Atlantean clothing, apart from ceremonial armor or high-tech suits, tended to cling to the body like wetsuits. David's outfit looked like beachwear, not Atlantean garb. More telling was his attitude toward water. "Atlanteans live in water. We love it the way you love air," Mara said coldly. "We don't shy away from contact with the sea. But you," David's smile deepened. He had always avoided getting wet. He wasn't about to pretend otherwise. "So that's how you know," Mara went on. "If I disappear, Orm will use it as an excuse. He hates the land dwellers. Your pollution has turned much of his realm into a dumping ground. He would take that hatred as justification to wage war and conquer the surface." "That has nothing to do with me," David said, his voice low, barely disturbed by the gale that howled outside the field. "And the so-called king of the seven seas won't be king for much longer." "You are arrogant, land dweller," Mara snapped. "Orm carries the purest royal blood among the Atlanteans. The royal family and common Atlanteans are almost different species. In the deep, they've adapted to the pressure. Their bodies are stronger than steel. The royal bloodline is 10, maybe 100 times stronger than ordinary Atlanteans." Her tone was scornful, certain. David chuckled, unconcerned. On land, Aquaman's strength was less than Superman's or even Wonder Woman's. But in the ocean, he dominated. Wonder Woman would be hard-pressed in water. He can lift 10,000-ton submarines and drag them to the surface against the current. In the sea, Aquaman's strength can be measured in the tens of thousands of tons. Orm, born to the ocean, would be even more powerful there. Mara hoped David would give up whatever plan he had and send her back to the seabed. "Even if you get the sacred trident, you may not be Orm's match," she said. "You shouldn't put too much faith in a trident," David replied. Mara had always been skeptical of the trident's legendary powers anyway. "I never planned to defeat Orm with a trident," she said. "Atlanteans evolved after sinking. Their tools and bodies co-evolved. An Atlantean dropped into ancient times would be an unbeatable warrior." David wanted the trident for its symbolism, a legitimate claim to the throne of the seven seas. A land dweller could not rule Atlanteans simply by force. He could conquer through slaughter and rule by fear, but the sea was not his home. Its sunless depths were alien to him. "A throne won through blood and chains breeds rebellion," he said quietly. "Even if I stayed down there, I wouldn't truly hold power." Mara opened her mouth to argue further, but before she could, David slowed. "We're here." Below them sprawled a beautiful island, its breeze warm and slightly dry, the surrounding water as clear as blue crystal, and the white sand visible through the shallows, an almost paradisiacal sight that might have reminded some of Sicily. For Mara, however, the sight had a different meaning. Her expression hardened. "This is where the Trench live," she said. "Why are you here?" The Trench had once been Atlanteans too, but they had devolved into something monstrous. Unlike the brine, crustacean-like but still intelligent, the Trench had only savagery left in their minds. Any creature who fell into the abyss where the Trench dwelt would be torn apart by countless mouths. Mara's face went pale with old pain. The queen who had raised her had been sacrificed to the Trench for marrying a land dweller, an act seen as dishonoring the royal bloodline. David watched the water, tone steady, because the lost sacred trident of Atlantis is down there. Author's note: it's cloudy and rainy today, and I'm feeling muddled. I'm taking a short break. If the next chapter isn't updated early tomorrow morning, it'll be moved to a daytime update, but I won't skip an update. Chapter Wonder 17, Luthor's Typhon Plan. A black, stretched limousine crawled along the highway. The interior was hushed. Lex Luthor sat in the rear, scrolling through his tablet, managing company affairs and occasionally glancing out the window. Two armed bodyguards faced him, alert and tight-lipped. A blur of blue cut across the sky. Superman landed in front of the limo, planted his feet, and crossed his arms. The car came to an abrupt halt. Superman, one of the guards whispered. The driver stomped the brakes. The two bodyguards leapt out, using the car doors for cover and training their pistols on Clark. A single word from Superman stopped them. "Put your guns away." Luther's expression dimmed, but he merely smiled and waved a hand, giving the order through his tablet. "If the famous Superman wanted to do me harm," he said coolly, "how would the guns in your hands help?" Clark kept his eyes on him. "I don't think he harms the innocent." Luther had not spoken aloud on the ride. He'd issued every instruction by writing on his tablet. Still, one of the bionic decoys he used to travel had been intercepted on the way to LexCorp. "It's a pity you're not innocent," Luther said, "and what's in that car isn't even human." Clark's goodwill toward Luther had evaporated. After the billionaire had used thousands of citizens as bait to trap him, Clark felt nothing but contempt. His eyes glowed, and twin beams of heat seared from them. In an instant, the bionic body melted under the intense temperature. All that remained where the figure had stood was a scorched pair of metal feet. The rubber skin had sloughed away, exposing steel bones and tangled wiring. The two bodyguards gaped. When had their boss become a machine? After one of his bionic decoys had been destroyed at the military base, this was the first time a LexCorp automaton had been used in public. Luther had been cautious, but he was still caught. "Gentlemen," Clark said lightly to the stunned guards, "don't let this spoil your work. It's not every day you get to protect an employer you don't have to worry about." He let the remark hang, then leaped away, his silhouette feathering into the sky as he bounded back toward the city. In a few great bounds, he covered miles, settled atop a tall building, and resumed his watch beneath the golden sun. Clark took a moment to lift his face to the sky. For 2 days, his vision had been a blur, big gray shapes and washed-out lights. But now, under the sun, his sight was slowly returning. He had been foolish to assume raw physical power could replace sight. Luther and the military commander at the base had taught him that lesson. He felt his eyes strengthening with each passing hour. More than that, his whole body felt renewed. Since collapsing from exhaustion 2 days earlier, Clark had woken with an urgency pulsing through him. His powers had surged, amplifying far faster than before. Each new day, he found himself stronger than the last. Far below, in a sunless underground fortress, Luther removed the helmet-like control unit that let him pilot his bionic body. His face was hard. He had intended the robots as a precaution, a way to shield his real self from danger while keeping his public persona active. But the current arrangement was humiliating. He could only project himself into daylight through machines while his true body remained hidden in the bunker. And worse, his attempts to procure materials for upgraded armor and more steel warriors had been stonewalled by the military. General Sam Lane had flatly refused to share anything and warned him off military secrets. Even Luther's other connections couldn't override the restrictions. Some projects were simply off-limits. He had underestimated how tightly access was controlled. A lab door sighed open. Luther walked down the corridor to the third underground level and stepped into the testing chamber. A tired, gray-haired scientist, Dr. Jones, a Nobel laureate, met him, barely containing his excitement. "Sir, our experiment made a major breakthrough. We successfully modified 3 meteorite-derived mutation abilities in a single subject." Luther watched through thick bulletproof glass as the demonstration ran. Rifle rounds pinged off the subject's skin and skittered away. The subject shifted its surface, mimicking textures and slipping into a near-invisible state. A security tester, approaching with a gun, found the weapon suddenly wrested from his hands as if by unseen force. Flames licked at the subject's palm. The air itself distorted, and the rifle's barrel softened and ran into molten metal across the laboratory floor. "How is it, sir?" Dr. Jones asked, his eyes bright. The scientist was right to be proud. To see one individual withstand a special forces exchange, render himself effectively invisible, snatch a weapon without a sound, and melt it with concentrated heat when the research had begun months ago with nothing, was remarkable. But Luther's face betrayed no joy. The money he'd poured into the project, well over $1 billion, had produced only the ability to graft 3 powers. That was a breakthrough, yes, but not the world-ending arsenal he'd envisioned. "Not bad," he said flatly, "but not nearly enough." Dr. Jones defended the work. With multi-ability biological modification now proven, scaling up from 3 to 100 or 1,000 powers was only a matter of time and resources. The breakthrough from 0 to 1, from 1 to 3, was enormous. I know what you've done, Luther interrupted, and I know what this team is capable of, but I can't wait. The world doesn't wait. He tapped the control panel, eyes fixed on the subject. Luther had named the program Typhon, after the monstrous patriarch of Greek myth with 100 terrible heads, whose offspring included the Hydra and the many-headed dragons that terrorized gods and men. He wanted a single entity that could carry a multitude of abilities, an army unto itself. A monster powerful enough to kill gods, in his words. He had intended to build this weapon from a distance, to use it personally as the ultimate trump card. But events had altered his plans. Starting tomorrow, he said, I will join the project myself. I will work in the lab. We will accelerate development and finish Typhon. He paused, the implication of his next thought heavy in the air. Norse legend told how Odin had sacrificed an eye and hung on the world tree to gain wisdom. To move freely in sunlight again instead of skulking in his bunker, Luther realized he might have to pay a comparable price, physically alter himself, accept modifications that would bind his body to the lab as surely as his mind had been bound to his machines. He let that image settle, a king of knowledge, willing to trade a part of himself for power. Down in the testing chamber, the subject's molten residue cooled on the floor. Luther turned his back and walked deeper into the fortress, already calculating the costs and the transformations he would demand. Chapter 118, Magical Whirlpool Under the Sea. What? Where did you hear that? The lost sacred trident was down here. Mara stared at David, stunned. I have to warn you, the person who told you that might not have good intentions. The trident that had been missing for ages and could command the seven seas had actually been hidden in the territory of one of Atlantis's tribes all along. No one told me, David said, looking down and stroking his chin. He wondered what the first king of Atlantis had been thinking, leaving a trail of clues, even pointing people to the Sahara, only to lead them back to Atlantis itself. Why not simply say the trident was here? Did he think the mystery made it more fitting? The Trench are devolved Atlanteans, David continued. They lost their intelligence in evolution and became monsters, stronger than ordinary Atlanteans. Their reproductive system changed too. There are at least tens of millions of Trench in the abyssal trench below. Mara swallowed. Either David didn't realize how terrifying the Trench were, or he was mad. If you really are as powerful as you claim, you don't need the sacred trident to topple Orm. I suggest you go back and take the throne. She wanted to say more plainly, if he wanted to die, he shouldn't drag her along. As for what you said before, I already believe you. Mara regretted having scoffed at his earlier arrogance. If she hadn't, she might not be here now. I have other plans for the trident. David smiled faintly, as if he hadn't heard. He manipulated the gravitational field and plunged toward the seabed. They passed through the azure water and arrived above a vast trench. The dark, bottomless chasm of the ocean floor looked like a fissure tearing the world open, an eye of death silently watching any who dared approach. After a brief pause, the gravitational field around them dove. The disturbance in the water startled the deep-sea monsters. Nearly 2 meters tall and grotesquely fish-like, with sharp fins along their backs and elbows, the trench sliced through the water with bestial roars. Drawn to the only light, they surged toward the seabed. Under the purple glow around David, they poured out of the abyss like an angry swarm, a sight that made Mara's scalp prickle. David's expression remained calm. Purple light radiated from him like a lantern on the seabed. He shaped the water with gravity, and a massive whirlpool formed around them, 100 meters wide. The deep-sea maelstrom swallowed the trench as they leapt and shrieked. Their cries were like ghosts and set Mara's heart racing, but the creatures were swept into the spinning current and cut off. The pale vortex formed a ring around the purple core of light, an eerie, beautiful pattern. He descended steadily into the trench. The trench caught in the whirl collided with one another, as if driven into a giant meat grinder, bones snapping, sinews tearing, blood tinting the water. More and more poured in, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, like moths rushing toward a flame, consuming and dying in endless waves. Eventually, the vortex drew in too many, its force weakened. Some of the monsters even punched through the outer ring and slammed into his gravitational shield, only to be hurled back. Mara's heart hammered. Her eyes widened as she stared at the endless mass of trench beyond the vortex, convinced she could be shredded at any moment. David clicked his tongue, a trace of regret in his voice. It's a pity. You can't really call these things people anymore. Despite their frenzied attacks, entering the trench failed to elicit any real reaction from him. Wave after wave hit the shield. David accelerated, driving them deeper toward the trench floor. He wasn't worried. The energy he commanded made him almost a perpetual motion force, and the powerful body of the Eternal Deviant shrugged off their assaults. In truth, he could probably slaughter every trench in the trench with time. But there's no need, he thought. Below waited a far greater enemy. Karasan, the guardian of the sacred trident. The sea monster was said to be 2 kilometers long, a mountain of a creature with strength enough to shatter peaks. I don't have Aquaman's ability to speak to sea life, David murmured, so this is the hard way. With that, the gravitational shield he controlled became a battering ram, a solid sphere driven downward at supersonic speed. Flesh and blood creatures in its path were simply crushed. Among millions of trench, it cleaved a bloody path to the bottom. Mara's mind struggled to comprehend it. These monsters were built to withstand crushing depths, yet before this man they shattered like foam. Perhaps this land dweller truly is stronger than Orm, she whispered. After what felt like 10 seconds and an uncountable number of crushed bodies, they reached the trench floor. At its center swirled a deep, mysterious blue light in the form of a tornado-like vortex. What is that? Mara breathed. I feel a powerful magical force from above. You actually understand magic? David raised an eyebrow. Land dwellers, back when the Atlanteans were at their peak, our civilization was beyond what you imagine. When some on the surface still thought the world was flat, we'd mastered nearly limitless energy technology. We explored realms others never touched. Magic was one of the things we had mastered. Mara glanced back. Even the trench seemed to avoid the vortex, wary of whatever power lay there. She let out a long breath and steadied herself. On that subject, I probably know more than you do. That wasn't what surprised David. In the DC universe, Atlantis had many origin stories, some involving aliens, others a native people whose land brimmed with magic, still others linking its power to the Rock of Eternity. In many versions, magic was simply part of Atlantis. What surprises me is that you don't seem to really understand magic, he added. Up until now, Mara had shown only a talent for manipulating water, not the deeper weave of sorcery. That vortex is dangerous. If we go in, there's no telling what we'll find. Mara scowled but kept silent, uneasy as she watched the whirl of magic. David's look was steady, like a man who already knew the answer. Inside that whirl is the sacred trident and a sea monster the size of a mountain. Chapter 119, New King? Court Death, somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. Elite Atlantis warriors rode monstrous, lobster-like beasts as they patrolled vigilantly outside an abandoned deep-sea temple. Inside the ruined hall, 7 towering statues, dozens of meters high, had their weapons converged over a single point. Beneath those weapons sat rows of ancient, algae-covered thrones. King Nereus, what was so urgent that you summoned me here? Orm floated through the water, every motion radiating nobility. His golden hair and black armor marked him as a figure of power. Even the ocean seemed to show deference. He looked impatient. This place made him uneasy. It had been where the king's council met when the sacred trident still sat in Atlantis, and when the king truly ruled the 7 seas. Back then, no one would dare defy the monarch. Orm still looked down on the monstrous races beyond Atlantis and Zibel, considering them no true Atlanteans. An urgent and grave matter has forced me to call you, Nereus said. His face was grim enough that the very water around him seemed darker. The tone between the 2 men was cold and formal, soon to be father and son-in-law, yet showing none of the warmth that title might imply. Neither cared much for the arranged marriage. Both cared about the power it promised. My daughter has been taken from the royal palace. Mara? Orm's head snapped up. Fury flared across his face. The reported abduction hit him like a blow. Who in the 7 seas would dare take my fiancée? Orm had accepted the marriage to win Nereus's support and to help the royal family retake control of the 7 seas. He could not deny that he cared for Mara, the ocean's brightest pearl, with whom he had grown up, and everyone knew she was promised to him. I do not yet know, but the kidnapper left a message for you. Nereus gestured, and a disheveled Vulko was pushed forward by Zeeble warriors. Orm, Vulko said, voice low and ashamed, the person who took Mera left a message. He said to be ready. When he returns, Atlantis will have a new king. Under Nereus's cold gaze, Vulko relayed the words like a man carrying a sentence. He had been dragged into this affair. Innocent or not, it no longer mattered. His plan to ally with Mera and restore Arthur to the throne had been upended. A powerful young man had arrived and unsettled everything, like a shark entering shallow water. A new king? Orm's temper flared. He courts death. Killing intent radiated from him so strongly the water itself seemed to recoil. He clenched his fist, sending ripples through the hall. The sea beasts outside shrieked uneasily, like small fish sensing an enraged leviathan. The king of Atlantis must not be provoked. Whoever he is, I will tear him apart. Orm ordered. Summon the army. Turn the seven seas inside out if you must. We will find him. The abduction of his future wife was an irrefutable provocation. His command echoed through the temple. The warriors bowed and departed in silence. Vulko, exactly how did this happen? How did you end up in Zeeble? Orm demanded. It couldn't be a ruse by Nereus. He had proposed the alliance openly. Orm's eyes flashed like cold lightning as he pressed for every detail. He wanted to know who would dare challenge him. At the bottom of a deep-sea trench, a dazzling magic vortex swirled before them, its purpose unknown. Mera stared at it with rising alarm. She could not fathom where the man's confidence had come from. He sounded as if he had seen the sacred trident itself. Wait, did you say the deep-sea troll Karison is inside? She suddenly asked, trembling. The name hit her like a chill. Karison was a creature even the first king of Atlantis, wielding the sacred trident, had feared. The realization made her body move. She tried to flee, but the force field David had erected held firm. David manipulated the gravity shield with calm precision and plunged them into the blue light of the vortex. The world spun. Space and time seemed to shift. In an instant, they were in a calm, light blue sea within a different realm. A protective bubble wrapped around them. The water around them roiled. A nearly 20-meter mosasaur, huge and ancient, lashed its powerful tail and charged, jaws wide, teeth like knives aimed at them. David watched with casual curiosity for a heartbeat as the prehistoric predator lunged. But when it bit, the two inside the field were as immovable as fixtures in space. Its jaws could not find purchase. David made a small motion. The water in front of the beast stiffened as if turned to steel, and an immense inward pressure squeezed the mosasaur from within. Its eyes bulged with terror, and in the next instant its skull collapsed like brittle shell. Blood fountained from its mouth as it sank to the seabed. Without pausing to admire the result, David forced them up through the water and broke the surface. Above them, pterosaurs wheeled through the air. The overhead was not sky, but a glittering ceiling of glowing crystals. Islands and cliffs rose around a vast inland sea. It was a world contained within itself, a small world. This is the world's core, David announced after a quick scan below. Small packs of velociraptor-like creatures darted across a beach. From a rocky cave, a woman emerged, harpoon in hand. She wore armor fashioned from the skin of trench creatures. Long, gray-white hair spilled from beneath her helmet. She had been hiding behind a boulder, observing the sudden arrivals with cautious curiosity. Are you Mera? The woman asked, stepping nearer as she recognized the fiery hair and the familiar features that still hinted at childhood. Mera was startled. Why would someone in this isolated world's core know her name? The woman's voice carried a strange, familiar cadence that tugged at Mera's memory. The woman then removed her helmet. Mera stared. The face revealed was older, fine-featured but lined with time, eyes rimmed with wrinkles but still bearing a quiet beauty. Queen, Mera cried. The woman standing before them was Atlana, the former queen of Atlantis, supposedly sacrificed to the trench. Weren't you sacrificed to the trench? Chapter 120. Be careful. Don't die. That's precisely why I'm here. I barely escaped the trench and made it this far. Atlana studied Mera with a complicated look. The little girl who had once seemed like a young merperson had grown into a woman. She wondered about her two sons. You've been here alone for 20 years? Mera blinked. Why hadn't Atlana left? The Atlanteans had long assumed their former queen dead. None expected she would be alive. It's harder to leave this world than to enter it. Atlana shook her head. Without the power of the trident, I can't return to the surface. Getting in had meant escaping millions of trench monsters. Getting out would be worse. She'd have to face the trench's pursuit and encirclement over and over. At least then the odds might not be zero. How did you get here? She'd had no choice but to flee into the abyss to reach this place. But why was Mara here? Had Atlantis sacrificed her to the trench, too? Atlana glanced at David beside her. A weight rolled over her at the sight of him, like a small fish feeling the presence of a monstrous leviathan. Since this young man arrived, the small world she had lived in for 20 years felt different, as if she stood in the jaws of some unfathomable beast, her fate decided by its whim. He says the sacred trident is here, and he came for it, and I was taken hostage. Mara gave David a quick, guarded look. His eyes were closed, as if sensing something. She answered quietly. Hostage? Atlana frowned. She was suddenly wary of David. He's right, the sacred trident is here. It's really here? Mara asked, still surprised despite the strange small world and her uneasy premonition. Had Atlantis' lost treasure really been hidden in the home of one of the 7 tribes? Had some land dweller always known where the trident lay, but never tried to take it? No matter why he seeks it, Atlana said, he won't get it. David watched the future king's mother carefully as she spoke. The remains of the first king of Atlantis and the trident are guarded by the deep-sea troll Karasin, Atlana said. It's behind the waterfall in that canyon. She pointed toward a canyon where a waterfall fell from the island, her demeanor that of a queen, composed and dignified. Only a true king can claim it. She did not hide it. She pointed David straight to the trident's hiding place. But David had already felt it, through gravity, through some probing sense. He knew the trident lay with the first king's remains and that a monster waited behind the falls. Karasin's 2 kilometers long, he said. The front half's like a deep-sea crustacean. The back half is a cluster of octopus-like tentacles. Its size was like a mountain range. What do you mean by true king? David asked. Atlana's eyes flashed. If you're not of the Atlantean royal bloodline, don't try. Karasin has killed everyone who sought the trident. Its power is beyond imagination. Even a king with the trident wouldn't stand against it. No one can defeat Karasin. She had tried countless times over the years. If she hadn't been of the first king's blood, she would have been torn apart under those sky-darkening tentacles long ago. Mara was left speechless. If the first king had placed such a guardian that even the trident couldn't subdue, then how was the trident meant to be retrieved? And if someone could pass whatever trial Karasin represented, would they even need the trident afterwards? You heard her, land dweller, Atlana said, looking at David. You'd do well to give up. Since I've come all this way, should I leave empty-handed? David smiled. A troll no one can defeat? I'd like to try. He turned his gaze toward the waterfall and seemed to stare through it, lingering motionless for a long moment. No one will mock you if you give up now, land dweller, Atlana added, but David only remained still. Mara misread the hesitation. She feared he might be backing down, and a flicker of worry passed across her face. After all, that's Karasin. Karasin had been a long-standing nightmare of Atlanteans, the villain of every sea tale, a creature that could sink an island with a single sweep of its tentacles. Atlana frowned and scanned the island. A new, wrong feeling crept over her and grew. The air hummed, an invisible, immense power stirred. Pebbles on the beach vibrated and hopped. Mara stumbled at the sudden change. Be careful. Don't die on me. You're still useful. David said to Mara with a smile. Then slowly, he rose into the sky. He hadn't brought Mara only to unite Orm and Zeeble and rally the Atlanteans. He had another plan. After he ruled Atlantis, he couldn't remain beneath the waves all the time. He needed someone to manage affairs. Orm was out. Mara, a high-ranking princess willing to accept a cold political marriage for the good of her people, and someone she didn't love, was a perfect candidate. She could be controlled, threatened, and kept in line. What? Mara blinked, confused. Weren't they here for Karasin? Why was he talking politics? The answer arrived without warning. Atlana's pupils narrowed and her face went pale. She stared at the distant canyon. The ground trembled. The waterfall reversed, rushing upward into the sky. The canyon split as if cleaved by immense, invisible hands. The entire island quivered like fragile paper about to tear. A vast chasm opened, revealing the deep ocean that the island had hidden. Overhead, a man hovered like a god, already manipulating the world, tearing Earth apart with a sweep of his hand. The sight was seared into their eyes. Beneath the newly exposed water, a colossal beast, sleeping on the seabed for who knew how long, flew into wakefulness as if roused from a dream. The sea boiled. An unseen force encased it and yanked it upward toward the surface. Karasen roared, an enraged, world-shaking sound that made the ocean itself seethe. It writhed, lashing mountain-sized tentacles, smashing through tens of thousands of tons of water and creating voids. But the force holding it was everywhere and could not be broken. Something seized Karasen, dragged it from the seabed, smashed through towering waves, and hauled it above the water. Karasen! A shadow that blotted the sky fell over the island. The sun dimmed. Atlana and Mara watched the deep-sea troll, exposed to air, roaring and flailing, yet helpless to resist the pull that dragged it out from the ocean, their mouths open in astonishment. Their eyes flew to the figure hovering in midair, the source of the earth-shattering power. "My God,